No meu vídeo anterior, eu continuei comentando sobre a entrevista que o pastor Rodrigo Silva deu ao Jô e suas supostas evidências que ele apresenta com relação à ressurreição de Jesus. Fica claro nesse vídeo que o pastor tem uma abordagem devocional e não histórica da Bíblia. Se você não viu esse vídeo, sugiro que você clique aqui nesse link para assistir. O link também vai estar na descrição. Se você já assistiu, você deve ter percebido que o pastor falta com a verdade, mas agora você vai ver que ele leva isso a outro nível. Nesse trecho da entrevista ele diz o seguinte:
é o seguinte, tudo isso foi muito mexido e remexido na Idade Média, no primeiro imperador católico,
Constantino.
né? Constantino, inclusive as datas de carnaval, diz tudo para conjuminar, para juntar com as datas de feriados.
Exatamente, pagãos.
E também ele foi um pouco copydesk dos evangelhos, que tem uma opção de outros evangelhos que ele é que resolveu que não valiam.
Na verdade, quando a gente trabalha isso, a gente trabalha com a crítica textual. A crítica textual se vale de documentação anterior a Constantino. Então nós temos fragmentos do Evangelho de João, por exemplo, John's Highlands, que data do ano 150, 170 antes de Constantino. Outro detalhe, Constantino era analfabeto. E os evangelhos apócrifos que começaram a surgir, os famosos aí, com todas aquelas histórias, eles não foram aceitos no cânon. E até contrário à decisão de Constantino, que Constantino queria que eles entrassem. Esse é um detalhe curioso da história, não foi ele que selecionou 4. Constantino não tinha cultura teológica, ele, o homem era analfabeto. Constantino permaneceu pagão até o final, ele pretendeu ter se convertido.
Político.
Primeiramente, temos que entender por que eles estão falando que Constantino teria sido um copydesk e o que são evangelhos apócrifos. Pode ser surpreendente para alguns de vocês, mas Jesus e seus apóstolos não eram cristãos. Naquela época, os apóstolos eram seguidores de Cristo, sim, mas na verdade eles eram essencialmente judeus, e Jesus era o rabino que lhes dava os ensinamentos. Depois, os apóstolos, pelos relatos que temos, eram compostos de pessoas típicas da Galileia. Os nativos da Galileia naturalmente falavam aramaico e eram, em sua maior parte, analfabetos. No mundo antigo, só aprendiam a ler e escrever pessoas muito estudadas, como rabinos, sacerdotes ou ainda pessoas que trabalhavam com a burocracia do governo. Assim, durante a vida de Jesus, provavelmente ninguém estava lá anotando as palavras dele. Mas se estivessem, eles teriam escrito em aramaico, e o Novo Testamento foi escrito em grego. É muito improvável que os apóstolos de Jesus falassem grego e ainda mais soubessem escrever em grego. Quando Jesus morreu, um dos primeiros a escrever sobre ele foi Paulo, em grego, mais de 20 anos após a morte de Jesus.
For 40 years, there's no written gospel of his life until after the revolt. During that time, we have very little in the way of written records within Christianity. Our first writer in the New Testament is Paul, and his first letter is dated around 50 to 52, so still a good 20 years after Jesus himself. But it appears that in between the death of Jesus and the writing of the first gospel, Mark, that they clearly are telling stories. They're passing on the tradition of what happened to Jesus, what he stood for, and what he did orally, by telling it and retelling it.
Meeting in each other's homes, early Christians told stories of Jesus' parables and miracles, and of his suffering and death. These were not historical accounts, but shared memories shaped by a common past.
Como as histórias eram passadas de uma pessoa para outra oralmente, essas histórias mudavam e depois foram levadas para outros países e traduzidas para o grego.
Q was probably composed in the Jewish homeland of Palestine. Scholars do not agree on the location of Mark, Matthew, Luke, or John. They were separated not only by geography, but also by time. Writing decades apart, they composed their Gospels for tiny communities that were developing their own ideas about Jesus, independently of each other.
Assim, nos primeiros anos do cristianismo, surgiram grupos que tinham crenças muito diferentes e nem mesmo existia o termo cristão, que é uma palavra derivada do grego. Esses primeiros cristãos, na verdade, eram judeus, que só se separaram posteriormente do judaísmo.
The role of the synagogue was changing from a meeting place to a place of worship. Worship in the synagogue increasingly centered on Torah, as the Word of God. But John's community saw Jesus as the Word of God, and for this conviction, they would be forced out of the synagogue.
The Jews had agreed that anyone who confessed Jesus to be the Messiah would be expelled from the synagogue.
As I read John, I come to two conclusions. One is that this is a Jewish group. If you want to call them Christians, they're Jewish Christians. They're one group within Judaism. The second conclusion is that they are being more and more marginalized. That is, their appeal to lead all of Judaism is becoming less and less likely. They're becoming smaller and smaller and smaller, and they can refer to their fellow Jews as the Jews. They are feeling profoundly alienated from their own Judaism. In plain language, they're losing. And that means the language of invective gets nastier and nastier.
Somente cerca de 40 a 80 anos depois da morte de Jesus é que essas histórias começaram a ser escritas. Só cerca de 150 anos depois da morte de Jesus é que o cristianismo começou a emergir e se desenvolver como uma religião separada.
Now that Christianity has emerged as a group, as a church, as something not Judaism, the question that Christians now confronted is, what is Christianity? The second century is an age of Christian self-definition, in which the Christian church itself was trying to figure out exactly what is the new message, what exactly is the new church.
Certainly there were some religious organizations, such as the ecclesia, the church, the leadership, the bishop, the deacons, the presbyters. There were institutions developing in some Christian churches, but only in some, and this was not universal by any means.
We have, in effect, different brands of Christianity living often side by side, even in the same city. At one point in Rome, Justin Martyr has his Christian school in one part of the city, and the Gnostic teacher Valentinus in another school in Rome, and another so-called heretic by the name of Marcion is also in Rome just down the street somewhere. All of these alongside of the official papal tradition that developed as part of St. Peter's See in Rome. This is where we start to see a kind of proliferation of Gospels tradition all over the empire. And by the 3rd and early 4th century, there are more Gospels than you can actually count, and certainly more than you can easily read within a Bible.
The Gospel of Mary Magdalene, for example, shows us a Christian community in which Mary Magdalene is regarded as a disciple, as a leader, as one of the major teachers in the group, and one who claims that women should be able to teach.
Another text called the Gospel of Truth is not a narrative of the death and resurrection of Jesus at all. It's a symbolic reflection on certain themes that come from Scripture and are associated with the life and teachings of Jesus.
One of the important discoveries at Nag Hammadi was a complete copy of the Gospel of Thomas. Written in Syria in the 2nd century, this collection of sayings proved very influential and startling.
The Gospel of Thomas is nothing but sayings of Jesus. It simply goes along and says, Jesus said this, Jesus said that. Well, some of these things that Jesus said, according to the Gospel of Thomas, are quite familiar. They're very similar to things in the canonical Gospels, but not identical.
Give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar. Give to God what belongs to God. And give to me what is mine.
These sayings of Jesus are filled with familiar rustic images, like the parable of the mustard seed. But others are strange and unsettling.
Look to the living one as long as you live, for you might die. And then try to see the living one, and you will be unable to see.
My favorite of these is saying number 70, which says, if you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you.
Now, what is typical about these sayings is that in each instance, the sayings want to say that if you want to understand Jesus, what Jesus said, you have to recognize yourself. You have to know yourself.
With its emphasis on self-knowledge and Jesus as the revealer of secret wisdom, some scholars think that the Gospel of Thomas became a source for a competing stream of Christian tradition, known as Gnosticism.
Paul and Pauline Christianity would have placed all of the emphasis on Jesus' death and resurrection and the saving power of that death and resurrection. Gnostic Christianity, on the other hand, would have placed its principal emphasis, in fact, its prime emphasis, on the message, the wisdom, the knowledge that Jesus transmits.
Most Gnostics believed that Jesus was so divine that he had never entered into human form, and so could not have been crucified. This brought Gnostics into conflict with other Christians.
It's very important to insist on Jesus as really suffering and dying on the cross, because Christians were being called upon at that time to suffer and die as witnesses, as martyrs to their faith. And if with some Gnostics you could denigrate the physical suffering of Jesus, you might call into question that obligation to stand and bear witness for the faith.
Então se percebe que já no século II, antes de Constantino, existiam dezenas de evangelhos, e várias correntes concorrentes do cristianismo, como os gnósticos e os marciônicos, que eram diferentes da ortodoxia. Era difícil para os teólogos da época precisarem a autenticidade dos evangelhos. Hoje se sabe que Marcos foi o primeiro, mas na época se fazia necessário estabelecer uma unificação das crenças que se tornavam cada vez mais divergentes. Muitos estudiosos acreditam que houve um evangelho chamado que nunca foi encontrado, mas que possivelmente foi uma fonte para os evangelhos de Lucas e Mateus.
And Irenaeus was trying to unify those who were left. What frustrated him is that they didn't all believe the same thing. They didn't all gather under one kind of leadership. And he, like others, was deeply aware of the dangers of fragmentation.
Irenaeus thundered against those he saw as heretics, including the so-called Gnostics.
Let those persons who blaspheme the Creator, as do all the falsely so-called Gnostics, be recognized as agents of Satan by all who worship God.
Bishop Irenaeus coined the term we call orthodox. Now, literally in Greek, orthodox means straight thinking. It's like orthodontia means straight teeth. I mean, orthodox means straight ideas. And those who didn't agree with his ideas, he called heterodox. That means simply thinking otherwise. Or heretics, which means people who make choices about what to think. Irenaeus didn't want people making choices. He wanted them thinking what the bishop told them to think.
Irenaeus had to contend not only with those who believed in vastly different gospels, but also with the followers of Marcion, who believed that Jesus should be represented by just one gospel. He looked for a compromise.
Irenaeus says that the number of the Gospels is properly 4. These are the earliest, these are the best, but 4 is the right number. After all, there's 4 corners to the world, there's 4 winds, there are 4 areas of heaven, and there are 4 beasts who reveal God's will in the apocalypse. 4 is the right number. These are the 4.
Mas ao contrário do que o Jô disse, não foi Constantino quem definiu os evangelhos canônicos. Se pode questionar as razões que levaram Irineu a escolher apenas 4 evangelhos. 4 cantos do mundo? 4 cavaleiros do Apocalipse? Essas não me parecem boas razões teológicas, mas sim um critério arbitrário para incluir os evangelhos que ele mais gostava e excluir os evangelhos que para ele eram considerados hereges. No fim, foi uma decisão arbitrária. Irineu poderia até ter suas supostas razões teológicas para justificar o estabelecimento dos 4 evangelhos. Mas ele não tinha força política ou militar para estabelecer a sua preferência particular em detrimento das outras. Para interromper o processo de fragmentação que tomava conta do cristianismo, ele precisava de alguém como Constantino. Alguém que pudesse fazê-lo pela força do império e da espada. Mas será que Constantino era analfabeto? Será que ele não tinha cultura teológica?
But Diocletian knows how easily his chosen co-emperors could turn on him. To prevent this, he keeps their sons, including Constantine, in his court. where they are trained as master soldiers under his watchful eye.
Constantine was sent off to the court of Diocletian to obtain the proper education for a member of the upper class, a literary education, philosophical education. He learned Greek, which he wouldn't have known, but most important, he had a military education.
Mas o Rodrigo disse:
Constantino não tinha cultura teológica, ele é um homem era analfabeto.
Por que diabos ele diria isso? Alguns autores afirmam que Constantino não tinha cultura porque eles precisavam desqualificar o papel fundamental que ele teve em consolidar o cânon bíblico, ou seja, pela força. Na verdade, o cânon, o conjunto dos livros, teve inúmeras variações e ele só se consolidou depois da invenção da prensa móvel. Isso porque a impressão permitiu a eliminação dos copistas, que era uma grande fonte de adulteração dos textos. Apesar disso, até hoje existem diferentes versões do cânon entre certas denominações evangélicas e a versão católica, que não concordam com os livros de muitas outras versões e nem suas traduções. Era muito difícil na antiguidade manter um texto constante, pois copiar um texto era caro, difícil e sempre sujeito a erros e manipulações. Assim, era inevitável que cada um dos grupos cristãos desenvolvesse suas próprias versões do cristianismo e, por consequência, as suas próprias versões dos evangelhos.
Na verdade, quando a gente trabalha isso, a gente trabalha com a crítica textual. A crítica textual se vale de documentação anterior a Constantino. Então nós temos fragmentos do Evangelho de João, por exemplo, John's Highlands, que data do ano 150, 170 a.C. de Constantino.
Por que Rodrigo fala disso? Em primeiro lugar, a crítica textual é mais do que a análise de fragmentos. Eu não acho que ele está querendo implicar isso, mas ele parece querer dar a impressão que há uma historicidade de João anterior à dos evangelhos apócrifos. O problema é que tanto os evangelhos apócrifos como o evangelho de João são anteriores a Constantino e são datados por volta do segundo século. Ele se refere a um fragmento chamado P52 da biblioteca de John Highlands. O P52 é um pedacinho de 9 por 6 centímetros, escrito com letras grandes e tem umas poucas palavras do evangelho de João. Esse é um dos mais antigos manuscritos existentes do Evangelho de João, já que não existem originais da Bíblia. O Rodrigo fala que o fragmento é de 150 anos antes de Constantino, que governou entre os anos de 324 e 337. Isso colocaria o fragmento numa data aproximadamente ao ano de 170. Entretanto, isso é muito longe dos anos 30, e coloca João como tendo surgido no século II, aproximadamente na mesma época dos outros evangelhos apócrifos, que Rodrigo tão prontamente quer desqualificar. Com um fragmento tão pequeno, é praticamente impossível identificar a ausência de alterações no texto. E esse fragmento citado por Rodrigo não altera em nada a ideia de que o estabelecimento do cânon bíblico foi uma decisão arbitrária. Constantino mandou copiar 50 Bíblias, o que possivelmente ajudou a criar as primeiras listas oficiais das literaturas tradicionalmente aceitas pela ortodoxia e a queimar os livros heréticos. Isso reforça a ideia de que Constantino consolidou o cânon, mas ao contrário do que muita gente pensa, esses livros não foram selecionados no Concílio de Nicéia em 325. Isso é uma bobagem espalhada pelo infame filme O Código da Vinci. No Concílio de Nicéia, se decidiram outras questões relativas à Trindade e à natureza divina de Jesus. Constantino queria também unificar as crenças dos cristãos arianos, mas no final não houve acordo.
Constantino permaneceu pagão até o final, ele pretendeu ter se convertido.
Um político fantástico.
É impossível, de um ponto de vista histórico, afirmar com certeza qual eram as crenças de Constantino. Só ele poderia dizer o que se passava na sua cabeça.
The turning point in the history of the Christian movement occurred in the first decades of the 4th century. It was a transformation filled with ironies. It was brought about by a Roman general who worshipped not Jesus, but Apollo, the god of the sun.
One of the most surprising Christian heroes in the entire tradition, I think, is Constantine. He is, first of all, a successful general. He is also the son of a successful general and at the head of the army of the West, and he's fighting another successful general, struggling for who is going to be at the top of the heap of the very higher echelons of Roman government. What happens is that Constantine has a vision.
in the dream, a cross appears on the sun. The sun was very important to Constantine anyway. He had a thing about Helios and very often represented himself with a sun god. But the intrusion of the cross was something new. And below this vision was an inscription, were the words, "By this conquer," in tuto Nike. And he interpreted this dream to mean that by this symbol of the cross, he could defeat his archenemy at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge and become sole emperor. And so he had so the story goes, he had his soldiers paint the cross on their shields. Constantine won the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, became the sole emperor of the Roman Empire, and then, in a dramatic shift of geopolitics, relocates the center of Roman rule from the eternal city Rome to a new city, Constantinople.
To reunite a divided empire, Constantine moved the capital from Rome to a more strategic location, the ancient city of Byzantium, and renamed it Constantinople.
When Constantine came into power and started to favor Christianity, he did do many things that plainly showed his support for Christianity. He gave money for the building of churches, money for the copying of scriptures. He exempted clergy members from having to perform civic duties on town councils, that kind of thing.
The bishops are able to take advantage of Constantine's mood and his curious intellectual interest in things like Christology and the Trinity and church organization. They're able to have Bibles copied at public expense. They're finally able to have public Christian architecture and big basilicas. So there's a comfortable symbiotic relationship between the empire and the church.
All that certainly stands in favor of his true Christian commitment. On the other hand, he did retain the coinage with the sun god on it. He did say the day of the sun would be made a day of rest, but it's very unclear whether the day of the sun meant the day dedicated to the sun god or the day dedicated to Jesus and his resurrection.
Whatever one finally decides about the nature of his conversion, whether it's a real sincere conversion or not, it has profound impact upon the future of Christianity, upon the future of Western civilization. Constantine's patronage doesn't just mean that a lot of new churches get built, though it means that. It doesn't just mean that the salaries of bishops go up astronomically, though it means that. It doesn't just mean that Christians have freedom now to worship as they choose. It means that it has become part of the imperial establishment. And obviously that is going to mean profound changes for the society and for Christianity.
Constantine showed his support by massive building programs, especially in Jerusalem. Ironically, the city that was destroyed by one Roman emperor was being rebuilt by another. But the new holy places in this traditional center of Judaism were now all Christian. To strengthen his new church, Constantine called for more unity in organization and teaching. But such unity came at a cost.
One of the first things Constantine does as emperor is start persecuting other Christians. The Gnostic Christians are targeted. Marcionite Christians and other dualist Christians, Christians who don't have the Old Testament as part of their canon, are targeted. The list of enemies goes on and on. There's a kind of, in a sense, internal purge of the church as one emperor ruling one empire tries to have a single church.
To appreciate the remarkable, dramatic evolution that had occurred in so short a period, one might counterpose the image of Pliny in his courtroom under the Emperor Trajan, sending Christians off to their execution simply for being called Christians, to the majesty of Constantine presiding over the great gathering of bishops that he had called to resolve particular questions. The imperium on the one hand being used clearly to extinguish a religious movement, the imperium on the other hand being used clearly to undergird and support a religious movement, the same religious movement in so short a period of time.
Nesse trecho do documentário From Jesus to Christ, você pode ver que a influência de Constantino foi massiva e também foi pela espada, perseguindo outros cristãos não ortodoxos. E se Constantino não era cristão, seria um bocado estranho justificar essa sua estranha preferência pelo cristianismo. E de fato, é difícil dizer se sua conversão foi mesmo por uma revelação ou por conveniência política. Foi ele, por exemplo, que colocou o símbolo Chi-Rho, que significa Christos, em grego, no lábaros, o estandarte usado pelo exército romano, nos escudos dos soldados. Esse símbolo faz parte da visão que levou à suposta conversão de Constantino, e é improvável que, se ele tivesse tido essa visão do sol ao fundo, com o símbolo Chi-Rho na frente, ele seria mesmo analfabeto. Mas ele manteve em muitos casos a iconografia de Apolo ou Hélios, que era o deus do sol. Mais tarde, essa iconografia foi incorporada ao cristianismo. É dela que vem a ideia de colocar halos nas cabeças das pinturas de santos e de Jesus. Esse halo indica o deus Apolo e também a santidade da figura retratada. Isso é um claro sinal de sincretismo religioso que incomoda a certos cristãos.
Constantine can only hope that this devotion at the end of his life will erase a multitude of sins. For Constantine knows that his day of reckoning is not far off. Old and unwell, he finally requests baptism in 337 AD.
It would make sense for Constantine to delay his baptism because emperors had a dangerous and dirty job. And sometimes they had to do difficult and sinful things as a consequence of their job. To delay baptism until the end of one's life made some sense. Those dangerous and dirty and sinful things that one had to do could be washed away before you die.
Haunted by these sins, Constantine wants nothing more than to die with a clean conscience, purified by the waters of baptism.
By the end of his life, Constantine is something of a sort of living visionary who, at the point when he's baptized, wanted to take off his imperial robes and live ever thereafter as a sort of priest.
At the end of his life, Constantine finally finds peace in the faith he wrote about throughout his life.
I know that I am in the true sense blessed, that now I have been shown worthy of immortal life, that now I have received divine light.
Se você não gostou, tudo bem. Deixe seu dislike e não esqueça de comentar o que foi que te desagradou ou por quais razões você não concorda com o meu ponto de vista. Quem sabe possamos bater um papo.